Welcome back to Black Mental Health Matters. I'm Dr. Kerry-Ann Williams. I'm a psychiatrist here in Massachusetts. And this is a show that's all about everything related to mental wellness in the Black community. So if you have a question or comment throughout the show, you can drop a comment. This is streaming live on Facebook and on YouTube. And you can drop a comment. We'll be able to see that, answer any questions that you may have. So today on the show, I have with me Deborah Jackson. So welcome back to the show.
Thank you. I'm happy to be back. I appreciate you having me. Always a pleasure.
Yeah. And so today we're going to be talking again about microaggressions, because as you know, every time we start the discussion of microaggressions, there's always so much to talk about. And I had found this list online of all the different microaggressions that a professor had found, or I guess a group of people had found. And we've only gotten through a couple each time because it's just so much to discuss. And so you guys remember Deborah. Do you want to introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure. My name's Deb Jackson. I am a clinical training and development specialist at JRI. That's where I know Dr. Kerry-Ann from. And I also have a business called Deliberately Daring Coaching and Consultation, where I do life coaching, relationship coaching, and also some consulting around just how people can live their most authentic and effective lives.
Awesome. So you guys can check her out at her website, deliberatelydaring.com. If you're looking for a life coach, you can check her out.
Come. We'll be happy to have you.
So we talked about microaggressions a couple of other times. You kind of defined it, that they are, they're comments and actions that can demean other people. They can make people feel excluded. It can belittle people. And it's kind of a way of upholding power and privilege, and it creates a hostile environment for other people, whether or not it's intended. And so there's a lot of ways that we do it. And I'm just kind of looking back at my notes from last time that there were 3 types: micro-invalidations, micro-insults, and micro-assaults. And we kind of spoke about that a little bit last time too. I don't know if do you want us to kind of go through that again, or maybe we just go ahead and launch into the microaggressions?
Sure. I think if we're looking at it real quick, we think about micro insults as being those things that seem like compliments but are not, and that can be really hurtful for people. So those are the things you're not like those other folks, or you're so articulate, you speak so well. Things that on surface sound like compliments but really are not. When we think about, sorry, can you tell the 3 again? Sorry.
Oh, so micro-validations, micro-insults, and micro-assaults.
Okay. Sorry. So we have I think I said micro-insults and I meant micro-invalidations. And then thinking about micro-assaults being those things that are really you are putting things in place that are harmful. Those are not the ones where we're saying it could be unintentional. You know what you're doing there. And it's very purposeful to make people feel belittled, demeaned, degraded. And so really thinking about that idea of these are things that could be happening on an unconscious level, a subconscious level, but they could also be conscious. And how much they are affecting people, and that when we're talking about it as being microaggressions, we want to really highlight, we don't mean micro as in small. We mean micro as in it's between a person to a person or a group, or, but it's not at the institutionalized racism level, although part of it comes from that institutionalized sort of educationalized system where we have these thoughts that we're taught and that we're trained, and then we're acting them out, but it's happening at a more personal level than necessarily an institutional level.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about some of the examples. One of the things that we had talked, I think, a little bit about in previous ones, we talked about the ascription of intelligence, this idea of oh, you're so articulate, you're a credit to your race.
Yes.
This idea that, oh, if you're smart, if you are successful, you're kind of an exception. And so you are, you're such a good representation of your racial group, that sort of thing. And it's, we kind of talked about that a bit last time, that, it's kind of assuming that people of color are not as intelligent, or that it's unusual for someone of your race to be intelligent. And then also, even if, say, another demographic, they would assume that everyone of that demographic is intelligent, and they just have this kind of stereotype or bias that people of this other people group, they are good at science and so on. And then the idea of being an alien in your own land, like people asking you, where are you really from? Or where's your family really from? Or, that kind of their assumptions about you not kind of being a part of the group. You're from somewhere else, you're a foreigner. And so I wondered if maybe today, let's kind of talk about some of the other ones. Maybe color blindness. This idea that when I look at you, I don't see color. There's only one race, the human race.
I think it's one of those things, right, that like sounded really good. Maybe like we were taught that. I feel like this was like a really big thing in like the 90s and like the early like 2000s, where it was like we should all just be colorblind, right? And so there was a lot of like colorblind hiring, colorblind admissions, colorblind this, colorblind that. And like on the surface, we can see where like, oh, it makes sense. Like we shouldn't be factoring in someone's race or ethnicity when we're making certain decisions like hiring or promotion or things of that nature. But when we think about like what it really means, what does it mean to you as a person when someone's like, but I don't see color? I'm sorry, are you actually blind? Because like, I don't understand what you're saying to me. But also, and I think this is a big thing that people don't recognize, most of the time when people are talking about being colorblind, first of all, they're Caucasian, right? And the assumption is that we are the same, but that means that you are the same as me, not that I am the same as you, right? And so that like this idea, I think it's like when we talk about integration too, the idea isn't that I will become more like you, it's that you should be more like me. And so that whiteness becomes the default, right? So, and we're talking about it from a racial lens, but we also want to think about all of the other ways that it shows up, right? It's like that heterosexuality is the Christianity is the thing that everybody is. It's all of these things where it's like, well, no, I don't see it because you should just be like me. And so I'm going to treat you the way that I would want to be treated. Again, sounds great until you think, well, maybe you have different ideas. Maybe you have different preferences. Maybe you don't want me to erase your actual culture so that I feel more comfortable with you.
So it's not just, so it sounds on the surface like it's saying, well, we are all the same, but it's kind of almost a drive towards sameness in the sense that it's not just that we're all equal. It's that, well, this is kind of there's a kind of a norm to aspire to. And if you deviate from that norm, the reason that we don't like it is not because you're Black. It's because, that's just an unprofessional hairstyle. It's not your race. It's just, this looks better in the workplace. Or, maybe you have a certain style of self-expression or whatever. And it's like, oh, we're not saying anything about your personal expression, but just, this is just what makes the neighborhood feel comfortable. That sort of thing. So it's kind of, it glosses over the fact that certain decisions are very much entangled with race, but that it's, we kind of paint with this brush that says, well, no, not about race. It's, you're just, you're
just outside of the norm.
Yeah, we have a standard. Right? There's a standard.
There's a standard and you're just not meeting it, but it's not about like your race or your heritage or your culture or anything like that. It's just that this is what, the typicalness is. So you need to get on board with the typical normative, standard. Yeah, and I think one, it sort of assumes that I want that when maybe I don't. But also it assumes that someone has had all of the same opportunities getting to that point, right? So if you think about something like, again, let's do colorblind hiring. Surface sounds wonderful. We're just going to take people's, applications, and it's that, I think it's one of the other ones there, right? That meritocracy myth. It's like, we're just picking the best person for the job, but we're not looking at all of, again, those institutional factors that make something more or less likely, right? And so when we think about how our educational system is set up, particularly our public educational system, it's built on taxes. And if I am a person of color, I'm more likely to live in an area where there is less of a tax base, which means that my schools were less funded, which means that my education may not have been as well, which means that I may not have had as many opportunities, which means you're looking at this resume and you're like, well, that school isn't as highly ranked, or you didn't have all of these, let's go with like internships, right? You didn't have all of these internships that someone else had. Yeah, I didn't have those internships because internships don't pay. And I needed to have a job that paid me money. And so, no, I couldn't go volunteer for my congressman for no money. I had to go work at McDonald's so I had money to pay for my clothes, right? Like, it's not taking any of those things into account. It's just like, oh, no, we just look at what's there. And then that's how we're making the decision. But you're really ignoring a lot of things that are feeding into that and pretending like they don't exist, right? Now, that's really problematic.
So it kind of, to me, makes me think of that equality versus equity thing. Because from the standpoint of the business, they're like, the standards are same for everybody. The standards are same for everybody. We're looking for these elements. You need to kind of have these kinds of grades. If you have an advantage, if you come from these kinds of schools, that's the same for every applicant. If you come from this background, this school, you have an advantage. If you have these internships, you have an advantage. That standard is the same for everybody. Doesn't take into account the fact that not kind of the circumstances leading to you having those kinds of experiences might be different. So they'll say, we're not discriminating based on race. We just have a set of standards. If you don't meet that, it's not deliberate that it's going to discriminate against a particular race. It's unintentional that it's discriminating against a particular race.
Right. And it doesn't factor into all of those things. Like, again, when we think about things like internships, you want me to work for free. That means that there's a certain amount of wealth that I need to be able to have in order for that to be able to be sustainable, right? And even more so, I think when we think about some of the, like, I know for my degree, I'm sure for yours too, part of in order to get the degree is that you had to be able to work somewhere for free. It was called field placement for me, right? And so it's like, yeah, you're going to give between 16 and sometimes 32 hours a week for free labor. But that's because you're learning. Yeah. It's to help you learn. It's to help you grow. Great. But that means I have to have money because I'm not going to be able, either I'm having another job and I'm going to school and I'm doing a field placement, or I'm living off loans. Yeah. How are we accounting for those, those factors? And so we don't think about what that means, particularly for people when you have to do your internships or your fellowships or your things of that nature where you may not be getting paid. What does that look like if you have to go somewhere else, right? So it's not even like I can live at home or live with a family member and just eat their groceries,
right?
And get the help. Like, when we think about like our political system and people who intern there, you have to go live in DC. DC is an incredibly expensive city and they're not paying you. And it's just like, no, it's for the wealth of the experience. Okay, well, who then has the opportunity to do that? Because I know that I couldn't have been like, yeah, I'm going to go take 3 months, 6 months, a year and go live in an incredibly expensive city and make no money. Right. But it's like, no, anybody can apply. Anybody can go work. Anybody can be a part of the process. We are colorblind and we're open.
Yeah, they're like, we're not stopping you.
Right. You're not actually helping anybody either. And so I think that when we want to think about what that looks like, right, we're identifying these microaggressions, but we also want to think about the flip side. So is there that we're looking at it from an equity lens? What are the factors that we need to be taking into account that really do make differences happen? How are we ranking and like quantifying those? And so I think about back when I'm a University of Michigan graduate. And when I was there, that was when the very big like affirmative action thing was happening. And excuse me, it was really interesting because all of the stuff that was coming out around affirmative action was this idea that like, well, Black people or people of color, they just get all of this money and all of this opportunity. And they're taking, first of all, the idea was that like they're taking the space of more well-deserving folks. Okay, we'll just even put that to the side because that is a lot of assumptions that are
Yeah.
false, right? But also, they never talked about the fact that the people who have the easiest time getting into schools are the children of legacies and of donors.
Right.
But nobody comes for them, right? There's no talk about that. And there was even a point system that was happening in some places where you got points for being the child of a legacy or the child of a professor or the child of a donor. Nobody was coming for those folks. Who you were coming for was the people of color. Like, oh, well, why do you get credit? Let wait. I'm sorry. Tell me where the struggle is that you need extra points and benefits because you come from a family that can give money.
Yeah.
Or that you were donating to this school, or that your parents were educated enough to be able to work here, and then you get to come and at reduced tuition. Like, but nobody has anything to say about that.
No.
That was never like discussed as a problem.
No. No, and it kind of brings me to, because one of the things on here talks about the second class citizen microaggression, and it kind of makes me think of that is this idea that if you're seen as having a certain place in society, it's upsetting to people when when a person who's supposed to be at a certain place in society is at a higher level than they're kind of thought or expected to be. And I think we've made room in our hearts for the exceptions. They're like, oh, well, President Obama, wow, we love him, and he's black, so
Right? And
we're
Oprah.
goodness. And Oprah, oh my gosh, we love
beloved.
Oprah, right? And Beyonce, like
Yes.
everybody loves, but wait a second, how many people do you want us to let in now? How many
Yes.
people do you want us to let into college? What's going on? There's kind of this sense of like, no, this is too much now. And
I think, sorry, not to cut you off, but like feeding off of that, right? It's the idea of like exceptionalism. And so they're held up, one as like, oh, well, anybody can do it because they've done it, but also they're the exceptions, right? Like Obama is the first, Oprah is Oprah, like, Beyonce is Beyonce, but like regular everyday folks. And so this was like years and years ago, but there was like a Chris Rock special, a comedy special, where he talked about like where he lived at, and like that, like, he was at the time one of the like best comedians, and he lived there, and like I think Jay-Z lived there, and like somebody else that was like really famous in the black community lived there. But then like his next door neighbor was like a dentist, and it was like the best dentist in the world. It was just dentist, right? And so there's this idea, right, that there are like why are you complaining? You've had this, people can have this. Look at Oprah and her billions. Look at, Rihanna and her $1 billion now because of, Fenty makeup and stuff. Like, people have it, people can get it. So you just need to pull yourselves up by your bootstraps and stop complaining. But also, they're the best of the best. When we look at like, say, the Forbes 500 list, I'm pretty sure that most people know who the people of color are on that list because they are at the top of their field. How many of the white people do we actually know who they are? Or is it just like,
exactly.
Generational wealth is a wonderful thing, and I'm happy that you have that, but you didn't have to be extraordinary to get that. You just got lucky in who you were born to, right? But that there is that idea that that the United States is like a meritocracy, like you've earned it. Well, people are wealthy because they earn it. And you even see when that comes around when we talk about things like taxation, because it's like, well, we don't want to tax the rich because that means that they get less or what. And I'm like,
being punished for working hard.
Right? Like, first of all, the majority of us are never going to get taxed at that level. So why are you worried about something that is most likely never going to be a factor for you? It could actually benefit a whole lot of people. But also, like, let's stop pretending that it was just their genius that made that wealth happen, because it didn't. And when you have like CEOs and billionaires that pay less in taxes than the secretaries and the mechanics and the janitors and the middle management folks, let's not dismiss them either. the folks who are really happy because they finally made it to 6 figures, but they're still paying more in taxes than the people who are at 7 and 8 and 9 and 10 figures.
Yeah, yeah. I agree with that. I think people have gotten used to the exceptionalism kind of concept where they're like, well, this Black person, we can see them in this high place because they're kind of like really exceptional at what they do. But if you're just an ordinary Black person trying to get through the day, people have a hard time seeing you in as equal to them.
Yes,
You know?
absolutely. Right. It's like, well, yes, I can recognize exceptional. And then there's everybody else. And then there's and even in I think when you're in the everybody else category, sometimes you're invisible. And then there's like the people who are really suffering in some way, poverty, you know, whatever. And like, well, you're just a drain on the system. Right. So either you're exceptional or you're a drain or you're invisible. And that's it. And it's like, wait a minute, how is this a thing? And really, what is that like? What does that say to you when you are trying to do something? I think we had talked about it, maybe the first time we talked about microaggressions, right? That idea that like you have to be better than everybody else in the room in order to get noticed.
Yeah.
And the pressure that that puts on you to perform and how much that leads to maybe some very real health issues because you are in a constant state of like stress, but also this how it ties your productivity to your value, right? I'm only valuable as much as I'm producing. And if I'm not producing at a high enough level, then I'm not going to be seen, I'm not going to be acknowledged, I'm not going to be supported in this situation. So also like I can't complain. I can't make waves. I can't point out how things are wrong because I also need this job or this thing in order to sustain myself. And so even when these microaggressions are happening all around me and I'm noticing them and they're having a very real impact on me, I can't say anything because of what the negative impact is going to be, because people are going to come back to me and say, well, Deb, we're colorblind here. We don't see your color. We just, everybody has, or the, are you so angry? You're just taking things in the wrong way. That I don't have a racist bone in my body. I have Black friends. Do you?
Yeah.
I always wonder about that. Like, you are saying that those people are your friends. If we ask them, would they say that you're their friend or would they say that you're somebody that they know? Because sometimes there's a difference, but also I think that sometimes people use that as kind of like a get out of jail free card, right? Like, I can't be racist, I have Black friends, or I can't be sexist, like I love my wife and my mother and my daughters, right? Or I can't be homophobic, I have a gay friend, or whatever the thing is, right? It's you pull this out, and one, that makes it seem like you have the same level of care for those people as you do for everyone, which, let's be frank, is a lie. Like, I don't have the same regard for the person on the street as I do for my best friend.
Right.
They didn't put in emotional labor and sweat equity with me. So obviously I'm going to be much more concerned about them than I am about somebody who I randomly don't know, right? And I'm a social worker and I try to believe in social justice and I want everyone to succeed, but also I'm gonna go a lot farther for the person who I consider my best friend than some random person on the street. Like, let's just be honest about that. But also it somehow makes it sound like, well, this person who's my friend and is a part of this marginalized group says it's okay, so I don't know why you all are upset. Well, we're not a monolith. Like, I can't, when I come onto this show, I'm not like Deb Jackson speaking for all Black women everywhere. Let me tell you what the Black woman opinion is on the, like, no, I'm speaking for myself. I'm coming from an individual thing. So I might see something and be like, yeah, that's cool. I'm here for it. That's great. And you, who is also a Black woman, could be like, no, that's trash. That's horrible. How could you co-sign that? Right? Like,
yeah, but also, like, someone can still be sexist even if they have women in their family. There's a lot of men that are still sexist even if they have women in their lives. They'll tell their wives, "Well, you know, you don't need to do this or that. Don't worry, let the man do that." You know,
yes.
or you can have a diverse family and still hold stereotypes about racial groups, people's capacities to do certain kinds of work, can still hold all those same biases, even if the people close to you, people that you work with, you can still hold those biases, and that's, I think people sometimes kind of feel like the experience makes them immune from holding the bias. I guess the concept of the internal bias, the concept of the kind of that implicit bias is what I'm looking for. The concept of the implicit bias kind of is lost on them, that it's something that's partially outside of their awareness. So it can exist even if you have a close friend, even if you have a spouse, you can still hold some of these biases. So the work is ongoing.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. It's like when we talk about like historically, like there were slave owners that were raping their property, and even like now where it's like being like, oh, so and so was the Sally Hemings was the mistress. You're not the mistress when you were owned. Like that's first. And also like, and your children were still considered property. So like, let's not pretend that somehow like makes it immune. Or, you have people who maybe engage in domestic violence who will tell you that they love their partners. They also had no problem being physically violent, or emotionally abusive with them or so forth. And so I think that's a really good point about like, it doesn't mean that you don't have it, and people really try to, I think, minimize the impact of that. And I think that when we're then thinking about the impact on mental health, right, it's that sometimes the fallout for calling out the microaggression is more than what the person who did the microaggression experiences. And so it's, I don't have a racist bone in my body, or like, you're the racist because you're saying I'm racist. And then it becomes about that. And it's just like, okay, I already didn't have like the energy and the capacity and the desire to like deal with this, but I certainly don't want to also then have to deal with how your feelings were hurt because I called you out on the thing that you did that was problematic. And so sometimes people legitimately just say nothing because it's like, let me just deal with the thing. I don't want to have to deal with the things that come from calling out.
And that was addressed in the book, White Fragility, where I think she spoke about holding a conference. And at some point in time in the conference, as they kind of tried to explore different things that people had said, I guess a white woman was feeling so upset about being called out about something that she herself had said, that eventually the focus in the whole conference kind of turned to like comforting this white woman, because she was like tearful about like, and kind of, I don't remember all the details of whether she was feeling attacked or what it was, but, someone had basically tried to get her to kind of reflect on something that she had said or done that was racist. And what had happened was that the attention shifted onto the white woman instead. And everybody's trying to make her feel better. Everybody's trying to comfort her. And then the person who was actually aggressed upon becomes either lost, invisible, or they're suddenly kind of the aggressor.
Yes.
For just
right? Like, how dare you make that person feel bad?
Yeah.
Right? How dare you not assume good intentions? Which is something that I think when you're doing DE&I work, that is like a really common phrase. We're going to assume good intentions, except for what happens, one, when people don't have good intentions, but now you're telling me I have to assume good intentions. So then when I call people out for their problematic stuff, it's like, well, you didn't assume good intentions and blah, blah, blah. Okay. But also like, it really just diminishes the fact that like intent over impact.
Yeah.
Like, no, I'm telling you something was problematic and now you want to talk about that wasn't your intention. I don't care. I legitimately do not care about what your intention was. I want you to feel my impact and then move forward. And there's, I think, a really interesting thing that is happening even more so in our country right now, where it's just about like how people feel about a thing, right? Like when you think about all of the stuff that's going around like critical race theory, because somebody somewhere heard a buzzword and made it into a freaking thing. And now we have legitimately like whole school boards that are like banning books from classrooms and talking about how if you're talking about the Holocaust, you have to say the other side of the Holocaust, right? Or you have to, if you talk about the Ku Klux Klan, you have to talk about like what the good things were. about a hate group? What? Like, how have we gotten here? It's because somebody had a buzzword and then other people got upset. And it's like, oh, well, when you're talking about this critical race theory, which I think most people don't even know what it is, and they're thinking it's something that it's not, right? But this idea that, like, hey, we want everybody to see value in who they are. And so we want to, share experiences and stories and things that speak to that. And how it has become into this thing where, like, well, you're trying to make the white kids feel bad about being white. And so we have to stop that. So in response to the fact that you think that what this is actually about is making white kids feel bad, which is not the purpose of it at all, we are now talking about the fact that, like, we are banning certain books, banning certain materials from school books, from classrooms, that there are educators who are literally in fear of, like, getting fired because they want to talk about how slavery was bad. The Holocaust was bad. Martin Luther King was assassinated. Like, facts. We're not even talking about the, like, nuancy things. We're saying, like, in third grade class, we can't talk about slavery was bad. Okay.
It's interesting, but it's a really interesting kind of thing. And I sometimes I draw on my perspective as an immigrant, because the way that history is taught in Jamaica is, of course, different from the way history is taught in the U.S. In terms of who are the kind of like celebrating the survivors. I feel like in the Caribbean cultures are pretty good at kind of celebrating people who survived, and kind of the freedom fighters and these sorts of things. And I feel like in the U.S. there seems to be a conflict about who to celebrate and what to celebrate. And there seems to be kind of an issue where I guess certain things are considered like real history and the other things are considered, I don't know what they're considered, but they're not really ranked at the same level. Maybe it goes back to the whole idea of the second class citizen kind of principle of certain aspects of history are more important and their core teaching. And then other aspects of history are less important. And you can go through your whole life and not really fully understand if you're white, you can go through your whole life and not really fully understand the history of slavery and still survive in this country and is of no consequence. But if you're a Black person in this country, you don't have that same privilege of just going through life not knowing your history of, in that way. I mean, you can not read about the details, but you're going to know certain things just by virtue of who you are. It's very,
I think that right, bringing it back to where we started when we talk about the colorblindness thing, right? Because what we're considering history is written, one, by the victors, but also that when we're trying to now have this more nuanced discussion where it's like, well, let's bring in this other perspective. Let's talk about these other things. It's like, no, that's too much. So we have people who are actively, like, fighting for Confederate statues to remain.
I was thinking about that, this idea that if you remove a Confederate statue, that somehow you're erasing history. It's like, how you can't erase history by removing a statue.
Right. But then when we're saying, like, oh, well, can we also then talk about, like, the Tulsa massacre? No, too much. Like, make that make sense. And so I think that goes into that idea of, like, the colorblindness, right? Like, we want you to know the things that we consider important. And so we're going to talk about how, like, Christopher Columbus discovered America. We're not going to talk about the fact that there were millions of people already here living their best lives. And he was lost. And also, and I just found this out, like, during this Indigenous People Day, where it was like, he was literally so, like, shamed because he was such a horrible person that Spain, who were the people who did, like, the Spanish Inquisition, was like, yeah, we're taking all of your, like, titles and, like, things away. Like, you're horrible for our standards, right? Never learned that before this year. Why? Because it was never taught anywhere. It was like, no, he was revered. He was wonderful. He did all of these things. And, like, the fact that we learned the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria, but we can't name whose land we're on. What? because someone decided what the history was, and this was what we all needed to know. And then when we're saying, hey, actually, this is problematic and untrue, and like, let's be more well-rounded in our approach, somehow that is like undoing and racist, and we're not being, we're not celebrating what America is and all of this stuff. And it's just like, let's look at that. And let's look at like what the ongoing microaggression of that is. If you are someone who is indigenous to this land, and all of the stories that have come out in the past year around the boarding schools and the children that were, found in mass graves there, and the part of being a citizen in this country is that you were born here, but Native Americans didn't get citizenship until the 1970s, I think it was. Like, you were here before anybody, and all of these things. And it's just like, but what we are going to do is celebrate this person who got lost and also never actually stepped foot in the United States of America. Awesome. Thanks.
Right. And it kind of makes you
think that's not microaggressive at all.
So they have the environmental microaggressions. And it is kind of that example you gave, where, see, for example, college or university buildings are all named after heterosexual upper class males. That sort of thing, where you go to a school that's named after a Confederate general,
right?
You have to look at the statues, but then you kind of wonder about how the history of your own people are undervalued. And it just kind of makes me think of how much history is shaped by who's writing the history. You mentioned that in the US, history is written by the victors, the people that are kind of at the top of society. Whereas I think in places like the Caribbean, history is, obviously history is always written by kind of the more educated people, but it is, there's more of a chance for the people that survived, that the survivors, the ones who had things happen to them, they're also involved in the writing of history. And probably to a different percentage, than in the US. So it's very interesting to kind of see that kind of play out. And as things get uncovered, as things unfold, and we realize all this history that's been suppressed and undervalued kind of coming out, everybody's like, oh my gosh, I didn't even know.
I think that just how much, because there is this standard, right, that we're taught these things from a very young age, and that this is, what it means to be American, and this is what it means to be a US citizen, that when you then are presenting people with facts, it feels like a personal attack, right? And so, the 1619 essays that were written that were just like, hey, we need to talk about the fact that this country was founded on slavery, and it was woven into its beginning, and what that means for folks. Like, people were so upset about that, even though it's fact, because it somehow seems like it's an attack on us, and how that relates to the other things, right? If I don't believe it's a meritocracy, if I don't believe that my own hard work and my own efforts got me here, then I feel like you're impugning me. And so how dare you, right? If I don't see whiteness as the default, if you're telling me that I need to know about this thing that I've never had to know about, that nobody in my family has ever had to know about, how dare you? And I think that we don't also think about the fact that, like, some of this stuff, because people want to put it like so long ago, right? We were just talking like slavery, and we're talking about like, Christopher Columbus, but like Jim Crow just ended in the 1960s. Like, the grandparents are still alive from that. And when you look at some of those pictures and you see the people who are yelling at kids who are just trying to go to school, who are, refusing integration at all costs, some of them folks are still alive. So we can see why your grandparents maybe don't want you to learn these things in school. We can see why this might be really problematic, because it's no longer like sweet little old grandma. And when we hear things now, it's like, well, that's just the culture that they were raised in. And it was horrible, right? Like, and my grandma is still alive and kicking at 80 years old. And that was the culture she was raised into. And she about to tell you she's not going to do it, right? Like, it's not going to happen. So if my grandma can learn, how come your grandma can't learn? If our kids have to have the conversation about, this is what I want you to do every time you have interactions with the police. This is how you need to respond. This is how you need to act. This is the tone you need to take. This is how you need to go forward. Why is it that white children cannot learn this as well?
And you bring up a good point about the folks that were alive in those days that were kind of screaming and kind of screaming at Black kids just trying to go to school. A lot of those people are still alive, and these are people who are making decisions from the education board. They're the ones that are in charge of things now. And so, yeah, they're making decisions about what kids learn in school and what they want their states to be like and what they want their cities to be like and all of that. These are people that are in charge, or they may have been direct descendants. Maybe they're the kids of those people. And so they've had a lot of these messages kind of taught to them by their communities and their families. And so then they make decisions based on those opinions about who these people are, who these Black people are, what history really is. I was definitely kind of shocked to learn about how the narrative about slavery was delivered in a very biased way shortly after slavery ended, even. Mm-hmm. During the Jim Crow era, this picture was painted. I didn't know this until I learned it, that there was kind of this movement to kind of downplay how horrible slavery was, kind of this idea that it wasn't as bad as it's depicted, that it's been overblown on TV, and that people, they had food and shelter and clothing, and that they were servants and not slaves, that they received a small wage, and things like that kind of makes it seem as though, well, what are these people complaining about? They weren't treated that poorly.
Right, because it's the idea like, well, nobody would have treated them that poorly, because then who would work and who would do this? Well, when you can't escape, there is no place for you to get to. There's, all of these mechanisms in place. Like, no, that you don't necessarily treat your property well.
Yeah.
And that's what they were considered. And the very fact that we don't think about the fact that it was written into our founding documents that Black people were 3/5 of a person. That doesn't just go away, right? When you're just, and that was about, that the whole reason why it was about 3/5 of a person, that we're counting you as a person at all, is because we want to have voting power.
Yeah, because it's
count you at all, then we get less votes. Oh, well, we can't do that. But we don't want to consider you like a full person. And I think about all of the ways where we can still see this played out right now, right? It's like the way that sometimes people talk about folks with intellectual disabilities as if they're not full human beings and don't have full spectrums of emotions and full experiences, right? And so it's that, well, no, like we need to have them in like homes where they can be cared for. And some of them homes are horrible. They've been shut down. There's a reason why we closed a lot of the institutions. And the same arguments that people make about well, at least when slavery, like people had places to live and food and all of this stuff. It's like, well, at least when they were institutions, they had a place to go, and now they're just out homeless. Or we need to fix the system entirely. How about that?
Right.
That we don't just count like housing, shelter, and food as the only things that you need to live a full life. And I think that the part of this that is really like showing the microaggression is because if you then said to someone, okay, well, if it was so great, would you want that? No one is signing up for that. No. Right? So when people act like they don't know, it's like, okay, well, how would you like to be treated that way? How would you like that to be your quality of life? How would you like that to be the standard that you live under? No one is signing up for that.
No. Oh my goodness. So the time has gone by so quickly. Oh my goodness. It's interesting because it is impossible to talk about microaggressions without getting into some of this history of where this comes from, where some of this bias comes from, where some of these impressions come from, the generations, the messages, both externally through our environment, what we see, what's modeled, what's on TV, what's in the kind of movies and media. And then, of course, it's going to influence how we interact with each other one-on-one, what we expect from one another, how we see one another, and kind of painting a group versus kind of seeing individuals and all these different things that come into play. So I want to thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's been awesome.
Such an important discussion, you know, such an important kind of thing to talk about. And yeah, it just kind of really makes me think about how in some places there's kind of this drive towards like, oh, let's just have a simpler life where we don't talk about race and we don't talk about these things. And maybe if we don't talk about them, they'll kind of go away. And kind of moving to a place where we can find out where to strike that balance, because we don't have to talk about race all the time, but there should be opportunities for people to learn about things, talk about things. Kids can learn about history in a simplified way. You know, we talk about, oh, we don't want them to learn certain things, but it's like they learn about wars. They learn about all kinds of wars, but you just don't want them to learn about the Tulsa Massacre. It's just a choice. So they learn about bad things in history. We just have decided which bad things we want kids to learn about. So it's interesting talk, interesting kind of time in history. And again, yeah, thank you for coming on, and thanks for all of you out there that are listening. If you find this content helpful, if you like this discussion, drop a comment, ask a question, let me know that you enjoyed this talk. And it will be uploaded later in the week to Apple Podcasts. So have a great week, and I will see you next time with another guest. Take care.
Thanks.